So the FAA just released its proposed rules for remote identification of drones in the national airspace. Now, I have to admit, the first pass through, I had a pit in my stomach. And what I'm going to do today is summarize those rules and what it means for you and I as drone pilots. So this is Keith and this is Alien Drones. Thanks for stopping by. I always appreciate it. It's really good to see you. So if this is your first time here, I do mostly drone tech, photography, tips and tutorials and product reviews related to drones and photography mostly. And if that's something that might be of interest to you, you may want to consider hitting subscribe. That lets you know if there's any future content that might be useful to you. So here we go. So yesterday, the FAA came out with its proposed rules for remote identification of drones in the national airspace going forward. Now it's about 350 pages, and I did go through and pull out what I think are useful pieces of information that you and I as drone pilots, both recreational and 107, are kind of going to need to know. Now, it's not a law, it's not a rule, it is proposed rules, but they do have a timeline for it. And what I'm going to do is summarize the important parts like who, what, when, where, and why, and give my interpretation of what this means for us on an everyday basis when we go to fly our drone. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So my interpretation of what they are proposing comes down to these 10 points. What is the purpose of this rule? Why is this happening? Who and what does this apply to? What does remote ID mean to me technically? What does remote ID mean to me practically? When is this going to be happening? So does the DJI Mavic Mini get a pass? That'll be interesting when we get to that section. Will my old UAV still work? Is it going to be obsolete? What are the costs involved? And now what do we do? How do we go forward? So I'm going to break these down one by one and give you my interpretation of what these things mean. And of course, as you're going through, keep notes, because as you have questions, comments, disagree, agree, let me know what you're thinking in the comments below. It's the only way we can actually affect the industry is, as a community, stay involved. And later, I'm going to let you know how we can affect this rule yet. So let's just dig right in. So what is the purpose of this rule? What are they trying to accomplish? So, in my opinion, it looks something like this. First would be the ability to identify and locate the UAS provides critical information to law enforcement and other officials charged with ensuring public safety. So not only do they want to make sure that they can locate the drone in the sky, but they want to make sure they can locate the operator as well. The second part of this rule is to actually establish some ground rules for what this remote ID is going to look like. And by that they mean they want to know what it's going to look like, what manufacturers are going to have to do, when is it going to be implemented, things like that. They actually have to establish a network, kind of like the LANC, if you're familiar with that, for the low altitude authorization, so that you actually have a network in place where the UAV itself can transmit information to, and that information can get disseminated to the right law enforcement or FAA as needed. It's also going to be the technical requirements of the actual data itself. You know, what's going to be in it, what type of information. Is it going to be just name only? Is it going to be the information of the drone? Is it going to be where you are, the coordinates, the altitude, all the technical information that's going to be in the data stream. So why is this happening? Why does the FAA want to know where a drone is in the national airspace, as well as the operator on the ground? Well, it comes down to these 3 points. This will provide the UAS specific data so we can advance the industry a little bit, such as detect and avoid and aircraft-to-aircraft communications that support beyond visual line-of-sight operations, autonomous deliveries, search and rescue, etc. So of course, this is your Amazon, your UPS, all the people that are already testing deliveries and autonomous flight of the UAVs for the purpose of getting you your packages on time and delivering your Starbucks via drone. Next, it provides airspace awareness to the FAA, of course, for national security and law enforcement agencies. This information could be used to distinguish compliant airspace users from those potentially posing a safety hazard. So Big Brother is watching. Lastly, the current registration process was an attempt to identify drones and their users. However, as the UAVs in the sky, they still couldn't identify where the drone was being operated from and who actually owned it. So that makes sense. So who and what does this apply to? Well, all UAS operators will be required to comply regardless of whether they conduct recreational or commercial operations if the UAV is currently required by the FAA to be registered. Now keep that in mind. All UAS produced for operation would have to comply with the requirement except amateur-built UAS of the government and UAVs that weigh less than 0.55 pounds. Yay for the Mavic Mini! So the UAV less than 0.55 pounds, of course, is the DJI Mavic Mini, is our latest introduction into the market. And it was bewildering to some why they actually released this just to get past registration. Well, now we know they knew this was coming. And this really does hit a nice spot in the market where right now, as this rule stands, the Mini, if you're flying for recreational purposes only, would not have to have remote ID. So from a technical aspect, what does remote ID mean to me? Well, there's two categories of this remote ID that they're proposing: standard and limited. Standard is going to have a dual transmission, which is one is going to come directly from the aircraft and simultaneously relay that information through an internet connection. So not only your drone, but the remote itself are going to be transmitting. So the second is the limited connection. And in this, the UAS will be required to transmit information through the internet only with no broadcast from the drone. Now, this would be designed to operate no more than 400 feet from the control station itself. So this limited model is appropriately named in that not only is it going to limit the information that's sent, but it's going to limit how far the drone is going to be allowed to travel. It's going to be restricted to 400 feet away from the controller. Not very far, a little bit farther than a football field. With some of the larger drones, that's going to be well within the line of sight and be impractical for a lot of the purposes that we use them for. So the drones will be required to have one of these two methods of remote ID. And if they don't, they are going to be restricted to fly only in certain geographic areas established under this rule. So in general, fixed sites. So basically you're going to be restricted to flying it in a field. These remote sites, if you haven't been to one, is kind of like a skateboard park is for the skateboarder. Restrict you to one little area, and it's a barren field for the most part. Not going to be very useful. I don't think the FAA understands that a lot of people who take these drones out are doing photography, getting images, going on the ocean, landscapes, things like that. Going into a field with 30 other people flying at the same time isn't the point of most of these UAVs with these awesome cameras. They're flying cameras. I don't think they get it. It's not the point of flying. It's the point of getting awesome images, and you can't do that in a fixed site with it sitting in the middle of a field. And if you have a drone with remote ID, and the remote ID fails or is disabled in some way, but it cannot connect, unmanned aircraft will not take off. So that's going to be one of the requirements that they're going to make the manufacturers implement. So practically, what does this mean? Well, this means that all the information while you're flying, the second you step onto the ground and start this UAV up, not only does everybody know where that UAV is in the sky, but they know the position of you on the ground operating this UAV. Now let's say we get ready to fly our drone, we find an area, some images maybe that we want to get. We do our research on the local rules and regulations, like this video up here shows. We find out what the FAA restrictions are. We go to the site, somebody walks by and just doesn't like drones. They think, what are you doing standing there? I think you're creepy looking in the bushes here. They call the police. The police instantly look up on their app, check it out. Oh yeah, this is Joe Blow. He's standing right down here on this sidewalk, which I don't know if he should be there. We're going to go check it out. So they send Officer Bob to talk with you and see, hey, what are you doing there? Are you legal or not? Maybe you're perfectly legal, but it's still harassment. You're still going to have to land. You're still going to have to sit there and talk to police. Not very fun. So unfortunately, I think this lends itself to harassment by bystanders and people who can look up on an app, general public, police, anybody that may not be pro-drone, and actually make it difficult for the hobbyists. Of course, they're going to shroud this in security, right? So that if somebody is doing something nefarious, they can actually find who it is and stop the operator because they can see the person manipulating the controls exactly where they are. Not so sure that I'm okay with all that. So when is this happening? You might think, it's a long ways away. Well, they actually have a timeline for it, and it's based on a 3-year cycle. So within the 3 years, 100% of the UAVs operating will be compliant with the remote identification requirements. After 2 years, no UAS can be produced for operation in the United States without the remote ID. So that means the manufacturers within 2 years have to comply or they cannot produce a drone. And after 3 years, no UAS will be operated in the airspace except in accordance with this proposal. So as I mentioned earlier, the DJI Mavic Mini does get a pass on this, so it seems, in that they did manufacture it just below the weight that's required for registration. And registration is the key. If it has to be registered, it has to have remote ID. So since it doesn't have to be registered, again, only for recreational purposes only, so still 107 or any commercial flights, regardless, you'd still have to be registered, and it would have to have remote ID. But for recreational pilots, it would not be required. However, once I looked through this proposal, there was a few things that kind of struck me in here. One is in the section that actually talked about the weight. It was actually discolored. Now, the proposal itself was in black and white. However, my guess is that in the original, before they published it, it probably was highlighted or a different color. Now, the highlight section was this here. And it says, the FAA envisions that upon full implementation of this rule, no unmanned aircraft weighing more than 0.55 pounds will be commercially available. That is not either standard remote or limited remote identification. However, there will be certain UAS, including amateur-built, previously manufactured, that might not have remote identification. A person operating the UAS without remote identification would be required to operate within visual line of sight and within an FAA recognized identification area. Again, a fixed site in your barren field. So because this section was highlighted, it made me wonder, yes, I see that the rules say below 0.55 pounds, but is there a possibility that they're going to actually change those rules for registration as well? So farther down in the information, I found this. The FAA acknowledges the dissenting opinion within the ARC, which is the Aviation Rulemaking Committee, regarding using weight as a sole determinant of whether an unmanned aircraft should be required to have remote identification. While an exclusion to any remote identification requirement based on weight or operational performance could make sense from a law perspective, the same cannot be said for the perspective of overall safety of the airspace of the United States. The FAA does not believe that weight alone should be the determining factor whether a UAS is required to comply with remote ID. The UAS may be used in a wide variety of types of operations that may present a range of safety and security risk regardless of the weight of the unmanned aircraft. So the FAA is dissenting from the rulemaking committee, saying that the 0.55 or below doesn't present a safety hazard apparently. They're saying, yes, we think it does. So it's possible that the 0.55 pound registration restriction will actually go away, and all UAVs are going to be required to have this remote ID eventually. Now this kind of makes sense. Sorry to say it. I love the Mini. It's an awesome drone. But if the Mini is flying in controlled airspace and nobody knows it's there, and it actually does have a collision with an airliner, I think the damage is going to be pretty significant if that bugger is sucked into an engine. I really do. So I get that it's really cool to be able to have this exclusion that allows you to kind of fly under quote-unquote the radar. But in reality, in a practical matter, it is a danger in the airspace if nobody knows it's there. So what about obsolescence? What about that Phantom 4 or the Mavic Pro you purchased that doesn't have the remote ID built in and you've already purchased it? What about the useful lifetime of it? Well, the FAA did do some research, and they found that there is a potential of that about 7% of the 107 fleet, the commercial fleet, and 80% of the recreational fleet purchased in year 1 of the analysis would not be compliant. And in year 4, would effectively become obsolete prior to the end of useful life. All the affected UAS purchased in year 1 of the analysis period, or 12 months after the effective date of final rule, would effectively be grounded in year 4 of the analysis. So they've built in obsolescence. Your drone is going to be no good anymore once you buy it. Now, I don't know about you, but when you start spending $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 on a decent drone, for the FAA to come and say, well, you're grounded, or, oh, you can go fly in a fixed site in a field over there. Nice, really nice. Again, pit in the stomach time. So lastly, what are the costs of this? So the FAA did do a little work, and it says that they anticipate that to connect to some service provider and where all this data is going to go to try to keep it safe, to keep the app up, to have a website, to transmit it to different law enforcement as needed so that it works properly, because it's important. You're talking about controlled airspace. They estimate that it would be somewhere between $0 and $5 per month per operator for a midpoint of about $250 per month. So they're assuming that it will be $250 per month, and my guess is it's not going to be per operator. My guess is it's going to be per drone. Because if you think about it, they are proposing that each drone have a unique registration number, and each one will have a separate ID. So if you have 5 drones flying simultaneously, it seems like you would have to pay for each one, although that's yet to be seen. However, they expect that the cost won't be zero for you and I. Now for me, for instance, that's kind of irritating, because there are times here, I live in Wisconsin, it's cold, it's blowy, it's snowing. I'm not going to be able to use it. However, I'm probably going to have some subscription I'm going to pay for anyway. So I'm going to get zero use out of something that I have to pay for if I want to be a drone pilot at all. Whew. Okay. So all that being said, what can we do about it? So this rule is not published yet. It will be published on December 31st, according to the documentation. So once this is actually published, there's a 60-day period for comments. Take some time. Comment to the FAA on these proposed rules of why they're not practical, why they are, why you like them if you do, what areas maybe they didn't consider. For myself, for instance, I don't think the FAA realizes that flying a drone in a fixed site is not some win. This is some dingy-ass field somewhere over in the corner, and I want to do photography of a beautiful landscape, a waterfall, the ocean, some waves, some event. Fixed site is not going to cut it, and maybe they just plain don't know that these are high-resolution flying cameras. So I'm going to make sure they understand this isn't cutting it. There has to be some exclusion, some exception. There has to be some way that we can accommodate responsible drone pilots in the airspace without opening them up to some kind of harassment from everybody who wants to view where we are on a website. So take the time and comment. It's really important that you have your voice heard. On your screen here are some of the ways that I have found. Once it's published, it's going to be available on the government website, so you can comment there. Straight mail, you can fax it in, actually hand deliver a letter. You can contact them through an email. So I implore you, take the time to comment. Make your voice heard to the FAA. So that's all I have for today. Please comment below what you think. I have my own strong opinions of what this feels like to me, but let me know if you think I'm on track or off. Until next time, good flying.